Have you ever noticed that peculiar contradiction? The stark difference between the simple, revolutionary teachings attributed to Jesus and the elaborate religious institution built in his name. It's one of those anomalies hiding in plain sight. So familiar, we rarely pause to examine it. Consider the contrast. Jesus, who reportedly challenged religious authorities, became the central figure of history's most powerful religious authority. The man who owned nothing inspired the creation of one of the wealthiest institutions on earth. The teacher who emphasized inner transformation became the foundation of a religion obsessed with external rituals, hierarchies, and dogmas. There's something almost suspicious about this transformation, a disconnect so profound it demands deeper investigation. This contradiction becomes even more striking when we examine specific teachings. Jesus reportedly said, "Do not judge." Yet the church developed elaborate systems to judge and condemn. He taught blessed are the peacemakers, yet his name was invoked in countless holy wars. He emphasized the spirit over the letter of the law, yet his followers created volumes of rigid doctrine. In each case, the gap between the attributed source and the resulting institution widens into what appears to be not just evolution, but inversion, not just change, but contradiction. The anomaly extends beyond specific teachings to the very nature of Jesus' activity. The historical figure appears to have been a living example of a particular way of being, someone who embodied his teachings rather than merely prescribing them for others. Yet Christianity transformed this lived practice into abstract belief, this embodied example into distant icon, this immediate way of life into promise of future reward. The pattern is consistent. What began as practical spirituality became theoretical theology. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if Jesus never intended to create Christianity at all? What if the religion bearing his name represents not the fulfillment of his mission, but its fundamental misunderstanding? Or worse, its deliberate distortion? What if the church didn't evolve from Jesus' teachings, but emerged precisely by inverting them? What if Jesus wasn't Christianity's founder, but its first victim? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of Western civilization, challenging our most basic assumptions about religious history and spiritual authority. If the church didn't preserve Jesus' message, but systematically transformed it into something he would scarcely recognize, how might this change our understanding of Christianity's claims? What might become possible if we distinguish between the historical Jesus and the theological Christ constructed by the church? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of Western morality? A philosopher whose father and grandfathers were Lutheran pastors, giving him intimate knowledge of Christianity from the inside. A thinker whose commitment to intellectual honesty led him to question not just specific religious doctrines, but the very process by which those doctrines emerged. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind the elaborate, theological edifice of Christianity lurked a fundamental misunderstanding, or betrayal, of the very figure it claimed to worship. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to separate Jesus from the religion built in his name? Could it be that centuries of institutional power have deliberately blurred this distinction? What if the ultimate blasphemy isn't rejecting Jesus, but recognizing how thoroughly the church has transformed him into his opposite? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about Christianity, Jesus, and Western religious history. They offer a perspective not on minor theological details, but on what might be the greatest case of spiritual identity theft in human history. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in early Christian development that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar transformation of Jesus' message and practice in the decades and centuries following his death. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how the early church systematically inverted key elements of Jesus' reported approach to life, spirituality, and religious practice. Consider how Jesus reportedly related to religious institutions. The Gospels portray him challenging temple authorities, breaking Sabbath rules when they conflicted with human needs, and criticizing religious leaders who placed doctrine above compassion. He warned against public displays of piety and emphasized internal transformation over external ritual. Yet within decades of his death, his followers began creating precisely the kind of institutional religious structure he appeared to critique, complete with hierarchies, dogmas, rituals, and public professions of faith. The pattern is remarkably consistent. The Church systematically institutionalized what Jesus individualized. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of Jesus' message. His apparent emphasis on the present moment, the kingdom of God is within you, transformed into focus on future salvation. His reported practice of including social outcasts transformed into mechanisms of excluding heretics. His challenges to religious authority became the foundation for new religious authority. The pattern continues. What began as lived practice became abstract belief. What emerged from a specific cultural context became universal doctrine. What challenged institutional power became institutional power itself. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in the development of Christian texts. Jesus reportedly left no writings, suggesting the primacy of lived example over written doctrine. Yet his followers rapidly produced texts that became increasingly authoritative, eventually crystallizing into canon that served as the foundation for doctrinal orthodoxy. The oral teachings attributed to Jesus, fluid, contextual, often paradoxical, became fixed, universal written statements requiring expert interpretation. The pattern persists. The living word became the written word. The dynamic teaching became static doctrine. The anomaly extends beyond teaching content into community structure. Jesus apparently gathered a non-hierarchical group of followers, including women and social outcasts. Yet within decades, his movement transformed into increasingly hierarchical communities led primarily by men, eventually evolving into the elaborate clerical structure of the institutional church. The pattern repeats. Horizontal relationships became vertical authority, inclusive community became exclusive institution. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss Christianity's evolution, doctrinal development, and institutional history at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation. How consistently the early church inverted key elements of Jesus' reported approach. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice the fundamental disconnect between the founder and the foundation. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that Christianity might represent not the continuation of Jesus' message, but its systematic transformation, not its fulfillment, but its inversion. What if the religion bearing Jesus' name emerged not by developing his teachings, but by fundamentally altering them? What if the church didn't preserve his message, but effectively silenced it by transforming it into something entirely different? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into religion were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether Christianity might represent not the fulfillment of Jesus' mission, but its fundamental betrayal. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between Jesus and the religion bearing his name? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if Jesus wasn't Christianity's founder, but its first victim? This question leads us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. The last Christian died on the cross. In the winter of 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche was working on what would become one of his most controversial works, The Antichrist. At 43, he was at the height of his philosophical powers, though still largely unrecognized by the intellectual establishment. His books sold poorly, sometimes fewer than 100 copies, and he lived in relative isolation in various European locations, as his meager savings allowed. His health was deteriorating. Severe migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight regularly confined him to darkened rooms for days. It was within this context of physical suffering and public indifference that Nietzsche formulated his most penetrating insights about the relationship between Jesus and Christianity. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine this relationship. Nietzsche wasn't an outsider hurling critiques at an unfamiliar tradition. He was the son and grandson of Lutheran pastors, raised in a deeply religious household where Christianity shaped every aspect of daily life. He had studied theology before turning to philology. His critique emerged not from ignorance, but from intimate knowledge, not from casual dismissal, but from profound disappointment with what Christianity had become compared to what Jesus apparently represented. What made Nietzsche's perspective on Christianity especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance or religious background, but the convergence of his philological training with his psychological insight. As a philologist, he was trained to analyze texts with meticulous attention to linguistic nuance, historical context, and developmental patterns. As a psychological thinker, he could detect the human motivations and power dynamics operating beneath religious doctrines and institutional structures. This unique combination allowed him to recognize patterns in Christianity's development that others had overlooked, particularly how the Church had systematically transformed Jesus' message into something he might scarcely recognize. During his periods of relative physical relief, Nietzsche would write in small notebooks, developing what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that Christianity wasn't the religion of Jesus, but something constructed largely in opposition to his actual practice of life. The religion bearing his name didn't represent his teaching's fulfillment, but its fundamental betrayal. As he would eventually write in The Antichrist, the very word Christianity is a misunderstanding. At bottom, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to articulate a disturbing hypothesis: that the historical Jesus represented a particular practice of life, a way of being characterized by inner peace, freedom from resentment, and joyful acceptance of existence that was almost immediately lost or deliberately distorted after his death by followers who transformed this lived practice into abstract theological doctrine, serving quite different psychological and social functions. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's meticulous analysis of early Christian texts and history. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how rapidly and systematically key elements of Jesus' reported message and practice were transformed after his death, not merely developed or extended, but fundamentally inverted. This wasn't just evolution, but revolution, not continuation, but contradiction. The religion bearing Jesus' name had emerged not by preserving his approach, but by transforming it into something radically different. It was this recognition of the disconnect between Jesus and Christianity that gave Nietzsche's religious critique its unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely rejecting Christianity as false, he was uncovering what he saw as a profound historical tragedy: how a unique spiritual figure had been misunderstood or deliberately distorted by those claiming to follow him. As he would later write, "I'll never forgive Christianity for what it did to Pascal, not to mention what it did to its God." This wasn't mere rhetorical flourish, but recognition of what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental betrayal of both its purported founder and its most sincere followers. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how Jesus was transformed into the Christ of Christianity. It wasn't merely a critique of religious belief, but a profound historical and psychological insight into how institutions transform, distort, and sometimes betray the very figures they claim to venerate. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for our understanding of Jesus, Christianity, and the relationship between them? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of early Christian texts, particularly the contrast between the Synoptic Gospels' portrayal of Jesus and the theological framework that rapidly developed around him after his death. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how Jesus' reported message and practice were systematically transformed in the decades following his crucifixion. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice. the systematic inversion of key elements of Jesus' approach to life, spirituality, and religious practice. In The Antichrist, published posthumously in 1895 but written in 1888, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. The history of Christianity, from the death on the cross onwards, is the history of a progressively cruder misunderstanding of an original symbolism. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that Christianity didn't simply develop Jesus' teaching but fundamentally transformed it, not merely extending his approach, but often inverting it into something he might scarcely recognize. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying Christianity's evolution, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its specific pattern, how consistently the developing church inverted key elements of Jesus' reported message. The historical Jesus, as Nietzsche reconstructed him from the Gospels, practiced a way of being characterized by inner freedom from resentment, joyful acceptance of life, and liberation from rigid moral judgment. Yet the church rapidly transformed this lived practice into its opposite, a religion characterized by resentment toward unbelievers, rejection of this world in favor of the next, and elaborate systems of moral judgment. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in the contrast between Jesus' reported attitudes and the theological framework constructed by Paul. Jesus apparently emphasized present experience, the kingdom of God is within you, while Paul focused on future salvation. Jesus reportedly welcomed social outcasts without demanding doctrinal conformity, while Paul emphasized correct belief and established boundaries between believers and non-believers. Jesus' approach appeared to transcend the opposition of good and evil through universal love, while Paul reinforced this opposition through concepts of sin and redemption. The pattern was consistent. Paul's theological framework often inverted key elements of Jesus' reported practice. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of how the early church developed as an institution. Jesus apparently challenged religious authorities and emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation. Yet within decades of his death, his followers began creating precisely the kind of religious institution he seemed to critique, complete with hierarchies, dogmas, rituals, and claims to exclusive spiritual authority. The pattern continued. The church institutionalized what Jesus individualized, externalized what he internalized, moralized what he transcended. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how Jesus' apparent psychological attitude was transformed after his death. In The Antichrist, he writes, "The glad tidings are precisely that there are no longer any opposites. The kingdom of heaven belongs to children. The faith that is here is not won by struggle. It is here, it has been here from the beginning. It is as it were an infantility retracted into the spiritual." This passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding that Jesus embodied a psychological state, characterized by freedom from resentment and moral condemnation. Yet Christianity rapidly developed into a religion centered on sin, guilt, judgment, and resentment toward unbelievers. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that Christianity didn't emerge as the fulfillment of Jesus' teaching, but as its psychological inversion. As he writes, "In reality, there has been only one Christian, and he died on the cross. The gospel died on the cross. What has been called gospel from that moment onwards was already the opposite of what he had lived. Bad tidings, a disangelium." This isn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition of a historical pattern. The transformation of Jesus' lived practice into a religious system that often embodied its psychological opposite. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across early Christian development. From Paul's letters to the formation of church hierarchy, from the codification of doctrine to the establishment of moral codes, the same correlation appears. The systematic transformation of Jesus' reported approach into something markedly different. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. But if Nietzsche's initial observations revealed this pattern, his deeper investigation would uncover something even more profound. How and why this transformation occurred, and what it reveals about the psychological and social functions of institutional religion. The gulf between Jesus and Christianity wasn't merely the result of misunderstanding,
but of fundamental psychological and social processes that transformed a lived practice into a theological system serving quite different functions.
As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the transformation of Jesus into the theological Christ wasn't merely doctrinal evolution, but psychological revolution, the systematic inversion of a particular practice of life into something serving fundamentally different psychological and social functions. The specific theological details might change across Christian history, but the basic pattern remained consistent. What began as lived practice became abstract belief. What emerged as psychological attitude became moral command. What liberated from resentment became vehicle for it. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche expanded this analysis. The psychological reality of redemption for Jesus was a new way of living, not a new faith. Not a faith, but a doing. Above all, a not doing of much that had been done before. This passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding that Jesus embodied a particular psychological state, a practice of life characterized by inner peace, freedom from resentment, and joyful acceptance, rather than a set of doctrinal beliefs requiring intellectual assent. Yet Christianity rapidly transformed this lived practice into precisely what Jesus apparently transcended: a system of abstract beliefs, moral judgments, and institutional hierarchies. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this transformation wasn't merely intellectual error, but reflected deeper psychological needs. In The Gay Science, he writes, "The desire for a redeemer, the believer in the Redeemer, neither is necessarily connected with that one individual who claimed to be God's son, just as the desire for an ideal object of love is entirely independent of whether there is or ever was a Beatrice in whom someone was in love." This passage reveals his understanding that Christianity emerged not primarily from Jesus' actual teaching, but from the psychological needs of his followers, needs that often led them to transform his message into something quite different from what he apparently practiced. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how religions develop, not primarily through preservation of original messages, but through transformation of those messages into forms serving specific psychological and social functions. The historical Jesus, as Nietzsche reconstructed him, embodied a rare psychological freedom that most people find threatening rather than appealing. Freedom from resentment, from moral judgment, from the need for cosmic justice. His followers, unable to maintain this psychological state themselves, transformed his message into something more psychologically manageable, a system of beliefs, moral rules, and institutional structures that promised future reward rather than present transformation. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that Christianity emerged not as the fulfillment of Jesus' teaching, but as its psychological domestication, the transformation of a challenging lived practice into a more comfortable religious system. As he writes, "In truth, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. The evangel died on the cross." What has been called evangel from then on was already the opposite of what he had lived. Bad tidings, a dysangelium. This isn't merely provocative rhetoric, but recognition of a historical pattern, the transformation of a lived practice that few could maintain into a religious system that many could follow. The pattern became increasingly clear. Christianity emerged not by preserving Jesus' approach, but by transforming it into something psychologically and socially manageable, by institutionalizing what he individualized, by moralizing what he transcended, by futurizing what he presented. By teaching people to believe in Jesus rather than to live like him, the Church effectively neutralized the most challenging aspects of his approach while preserving its inspirational power as distant ideal. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the gap between Jesus and Christianity wasn't merely the result of historical development, but of psychological necessity. The Church didn't simply misunderstand Jesus. It transformed him into something serving fundamentally different psychological and social functions, from embodiment of a rare psychological freedom into foundation for a religious system that often constrained that very freedom. What implications might this understanding have for how we approach Jesus, Christianity, and the relationship between them? And what might it reveal about the possibility of recovering something of Jesus' approach beyond the theological framework constructed around him. Nietzsche's investigation was leading him toward a disturbing conclusion: that Christianity represented not the continuation of Jesus' message, but its fundamental inversion. That the church hadn't preserved his teaching, but effectively silenced it by transforming it into something serving quite different psychological and social functions. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse aspects of early Christian development. The transformation of Jesus into the theological Christ wasn't isolated to particular doctrines or practices, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout the religion's foundational period. The pattern was clear. What began as lived practice became abstract belief. What emerged as psychological attitude became moral command. What liberated from judgment became foundation for it. A systematic inversion that transformed Jesus' reported approach into something serving fundamentally different psychological and social functions. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. The history of Christianity, from the death on the cross onwards, is the history of a progressively cruder misunderstanding of an original symbolism. This passage reveals his recognition that Christianity didn't simply develop Jesus' teaching, but fundamentally transformed it, not merely extending his approach, but often inverting it into something he might scarcely recognize. This wasn't just evolution, but revolution, not continuation, but contradiction. The pattern revealed itself in how early Christianity approached the concept of gospel, or good news. For Jesus, according to Nietzsche's reconstruction, the good news was precisely that no mediator was necessary between humans and divine reality, that the kingdom of heaven was present rather than future, that redemption meant freedom from resentment rather than promise of cosmic justice. Yet Christianity rapidly transformed this message into its opposite. A system requiring institutional mediation, promising future rather than present redemption, and often fostering rather than transcending resentment toward unbelievers. In the development of Christian ethics, the same pattern appeared. Jesus reportedly transcended conventional moral distinctions through universal love, accepting social outcasts without demanding moral conformity. Yet Christianity developed elaborate moral codes distinguishing believers from non-believers, the saved from the damned, the morally worthy from the unworthy. The pattern continued. Christianity moralized what Jesus transcended, judged what he accepted, excluded what he included. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in Christian attitudes toward existence itself. Jesus, in Nietzsche's reading, embodied joyful acceptance of life as it is, a practice characterized by saying yes to life, even in its strangest and hardest problems. Yet Christianity rapidly developed into what Nietzsche called a religion of suffering, focused on cosmic justice in an afterlife rather than redemptive acceptance in the present. The pattern persisted. Christianity transformed Jesus' affirmation of life into its partial rejection, his embrace of present reality into focus on future reward. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of Christian development. Whether in theology, ethics, community structure, or psychological attitude, the same correlation appeared. The systematic transformation of Jesus' reported approach into something often serving as its psychological inverse. As Nietzsche writes, the church is precisely what Jesus preached against, and what he taught his disciples to fight against. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that Christianity represented not the continuation of Jesus' message, but its fundamental inversion, that the church hadn't preserved his teaching, but effectively silenced it by transforming it into something serving quite different psychological and social functions. Jesus hadn't founded Christianity. In a profound sense, he had been its first victim, the original figure whose message was systematically transformed into something he might scarcely recognize. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if Christianity's relationship to Jesus wasn't one of fulfillment, but of fundamental misunderstanding, or even betrayal? What if the church hadn't preserved Jesus' message, but effectively silenced it by transforming it into something serving quite different psychological and social functions? What if the greatest historical irony was that the religion bearing Jesus' name emerged precisely by inverting key elements of his approach? This recognition wasn't merely an academic observation, but a profound challenge to how we understand Jesus, Christianity, and the relationship between them. If Jesus wasn't Christianity's founder, but its first victim, what might become possible if we distinguished between the historical figure and the theological construct built around him? What aspects of Jesus' approach might be recovered beyond the theological framework that has both preserved and distorted his memory? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore the deeper implications of Nietzsche's discovery. What does it mean for our understanding of Jesus, Christianity, and the possibility of recovering something of Jesus' approach beyond the theological Christ constructed by the Church? And what might it reveal about how institutions transform, distort, and sometimes betray the very figures they claim to venerate? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond academic religious studies into the very heart of how we understand Jesus, Christianity, and the relationship between them. If Jesus wasn't Christianity's founder but its first victim, if the Church emerged not by developing his teaching but by systematically transforming it, then addressing this pattern requires more than theological refinement. It demands fundamental reconsideration of Christianity's historical and psychological foundations. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the psychology of the Redeemer, his reconstruction of Jesus' actual psychological state and practice of life beyond the theological framework later constructed around him. This bringer of glad tidings died as he lived, as he taught, not to redeem mankind but to show how one must live. He does not resist, he does not defend his rights, he takes no steps to avert the worst that can happen to him. More, he provokes it. Not to resist, not to be angry, not to hold responsible, but to resist not even the evil one, to love him. This passage reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Jesus embodied a particular psychological state characterized by freedom from resentment, absence of resistance, and universal love beyond moral judgment, a practice utterly different from the theological system later built around him. The first profound implication is historical. If Christianity emerged by transforming Jesus' message rather than preserving it, then much of what we consider Christian might have little connection to the historical Jesus. As Nietzsche writes, the word Christianity is already a misunderstanding. In reality, there has been only one Christian, and he died on the cross. This isn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition that Christianity might represent not the fulfillment of Jesus' mission, but its fundamental misunderstanding or even betrayal. That the gap between Jesus and Christianity isn't merely developmental, but foundational. The second implication is psychological. If Jesus embodied a particular psychological state rather than a set of theological beliefs, authentic engagement with his approach requires psychological transformation rather than doctrinal adherence. As Nietzsche suggests, one could, with some freedom of expression, call Jesus a free spirit. He cares nothing for what is established. The word kills. Everything fixed kills. The concept, the experience, life in the only form he knows it, opposes any kind of word, formula, law, faith, dogma. This insight reveals how Christianity's transformation of Jesus' lived practice into theological system effectively neutralized its most challenging aspects, replacing psychological transformation with doctrinal adherence, present practice with future promise. The third implication is institutional. If the Church emerged by systematically transforming Jesus' message into something serving different functions, authentic recovery of his approach might require moving beyond institutional Christianity rather than reforming it. As Nietzsche writes, the Church is precisely what Jesus preached against and what he taught his disciples to fight against. This isn't merely criticism of specific institutional practices, but recognition that Christianity's institutional form might be fundamentally at odds with Jesus' reported approach to spirituality, that recovering his message might require stepping outside the very institution claiming to preserve it. Perhaps the most profound implication is liberatory. If Jesus embodied a psychological freedom that was systematically transformed into religious system, recovering something of his approach might open possibilities for spiritual life beyond both naive faith and naive atheism. As Nietzsche suggests, the kingdom of heaven is a condition of the heart, not something that comes upon the earth or after death. It is not a believing, but a doing. Above all, a not doing of many things. This isn't mere rejection of Christianity, but recognition that Jesus' approach might offer possibilities for spiritual life beyond institutional religion, for practice rather than belief, present transformation rather than future reward, psychological freedom rather than moral constraint. What does this mean for how we understand Jesus, Christianity, and the possibility of spiritual life beyond institutional religion? If Jesus wasn't Christianity's founder, but its first victim, what might become possible if we distinguished between the historical figure and the theological construct built around him? What aspects of Jesus' approach might be recovered beyond the theological framework that has both preserved and distorted his memory? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic engagement with Jesus might begin not with more perfect doctrinal understanding, but with recognition of how thoroughly Christianity has transformed his message, with the courage to distinguish between the historical Jesus and the theological Christ constructed around him. The liberation of Jesus from Christianity might open possibilities for spiritual life that neither traditional believers nor critics have fully explored. Possibilities emerging from what Nietzsche saw as Jesus' most profound insight. The possibility of redemption not through future reward, but through freedom from resentment in the present moment. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond specific theological details into what might be called a conspiracy of transformation, a collective cultural process that systematically transformed Jesus' message into something serving quite different psychological and social functions. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the gap between Jesus' challenging psychological practice and his followers' more conventional needs and capacities. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the historical development of early Christianity. What began as Jesus' lived practice, characterized by psychological freedom from resentment, absence of resistance, and universal love beyond moral judgment, rapidly transformed after his death into theological systems serving quite different functions, managing resentment rather than transcending it, establishing moral distinctions rather than moving beyond them, promising future reward rather than present transformation. This wasn't merely development, but fundamental transformation, not continuation, but inversion. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the psychological needs of Jesus' followers and the social functions of emerging religious institutions. As Nietzsche writes, the destiny of Christianity lies in the necessity that its faith had to become as diseased, as base and vulgar, as the needs it was meant to satisfy were diseased, base and vulgar. This isn't mere condemnation, but psychological insight. Christianity evolved to serve psychological and social functions quite different from those reflected in Jesus' reported practice, functions including the management of resentment, the establishment of moral boundaries, and the promise of cosmic justice. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different aspects of Christian development. Paul transformed Jesus' practice of life into theological framework, emphasizing correct belief. The early church transformed his apparent challenge to religious authority into foundation for new authority. Later, doctrinal developments transformed his psychological freedom into moral constraint. Each domain developed its own language, but the basic pattern remained consistent. The systematic transformation of lived practice into theological system, serving different psychological and social functions. The conspiracy extends into how Jesus' memory has been preserved and transmitted. His reported words and actions aren't available directly, but only through texts written decades after his death, edited and canonized by the very institution claiming to represent him. The historical Jesus remains largely inaccessible behind the theological Christ constructed around him, a figure systematically transformed to serve institutional needs rather than accurately preserved in his challenging originality. As Nietzsche suggests, the church, as it emerged, is the precise counter-principle to what Jesus preached. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability across Christian history. From early theological developments to medieval institutional structures to modern doctrinal refinements, the same basic correlation appears: the systematic transformation of Jesus' challenging approach into forms more psychologically manageable and socially functional. Different theological details, same basic pattern: the domestication of Jesus' approach through its transformation into something serving different functions. This recognition reveals something profound about Christianity's historical development, that it evolved not primarily by preserving Jesus' message, but by transforming it into something serving different psychological and social functions, functions including the management of resentment, the establishment of moral boundaries, and the promise of cosmic justice. The real conspiracy isn't specific doctrinal distortion, but the deeper cultural pattern of transforming a challenging lived practice into more manageable religious system. This pattern raises profound questions about religious history, institutional development, and the possibility of recovering something of Jesus' approach beyond the theological framework constructed around him. If Christianity emerged by systematically transforming Jesus' message rather than preserving it, what might become possible if we distinguished between the historical figure and the theological construct built in his name? What aspects of Jesus' approach might be recovered beyond the institution claiming to represent him? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of recovering something of Jesus' approach beyond the theological Christ constructed by the Church. What might emerge if we distinguished between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus? Why has the gap between Jesus and Christianity remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound implications for religious understanding? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective investment in maintaining the continuity between Jesus and the religion bearing his name. Addressing this pattern would mean questioning not just specific theological details, but Christianity's fundamental claim to represent Jesus' teaching, a prospect simultaneously liberating and threatening to both believers and institutions built around this claim. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The small community did not understand its master and reinterpreted him into something they could understand. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that the transformation of Jesus' message wasn't primarily deliberate distortion, but psychological necessity. His followers simply couldn't maintain his challenging psychological practice and naturally transformed it into something more manageable. The gap between Jesus and Christianity emerged not through conscious conspiracy, but through the natural human tendency to domesticate what we cannot fully embody. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the apparent continuity between Jesus and Christianity. The Church's authority depends fundamentally on its claim to represent Jesus' teaching, to stand in direct continuity with his mission and message. Acknowledging the systematic transformation of his approach would undermine this foundational claim, challenging not just specific doctrines, but the very basis of institutional authority. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the apparent continuity between founder and foundation. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying Christianity as the fulfillment of Jesus' mission rather than its transformation. From religious education to popular culture, dominant stories present the Church as the natural continuation of Jesus' work, rather than acknowledging how thoroughly his approach was transformed after his death. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural narratives that benefit from maintaining apparent historical continuity rather than acknowledging fundamental discontinuity. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but recognizing how thoroughly human psychological and social needs shape our religious constructions. This prospect is so challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of apparent historical continuity to the more demanding terrain of distinguishing between the historical Jesus and the theological Christ constructed around him. The pattern persists, not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comforting narratives over challenging historical realities, for apparent continuity over acknowledged rupture, and for manageable religious systems over transformative psychological practices. As Nietzsche writes, the Christian is not a person who lives in a certain way. The Christian is the person who accepts certain teachings. This insight reveals how Christianity's transformation of Jesus' lived practice into theological system effectively neutralized its most challenging aspects, replacing psychological transformation with doctrinal adherence, present practice with future promise. What does this mean for the possibility of recovering something of Jesus' approach beyond the theological framework constructed around him? If Christianity emerged by systematically transforming his message rather than preserving it, what might become possible if we distinguished between the historical figure and the theological construct built in his name? What aspects of Jesus' approach might be recovered beyond the institution claiming to represent him? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of engaging with Jesus beyond the theological framework that has both preserved and transformed his memory, not through more perfect doctrinal understanding, but through recognition of the psychological practice he apparently embodied. What might emerge if we distinguished between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus? The final question isn't whether Christianity accurately represents Jesus, but whether Jesus' actual approach might be recovered beyond the theological system constructed around him. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about religious history: how rapidly and systematically Jesus' challenging practice of life was transformed into something serving quite different psychological and social functions. But it also reveals something even more significant: the possibility of distinguishing between the historical Jesus and the theological Christ, between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the psychology of the Redeemer, his reconstruction of Jesus' actual practice beyond the theological framework later constructed around him. The kingdom of God is not something one waits for. It has no yesterday or tomorrow. It does not come in 1,000 years. It is an experience of the heart. It is everywhere. It is nowhere. This passage reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Jesus embodied a particular psychological state, characterized by freedom from resentment, absence of resistance, and present redemption, rather than future reward. A practice utterly different from the theological system later built around him. This isn't about rejecting Jesus, but distinguishing between the historical figure and his theological transformation, recognizing that engaging with his actual approach might require looking beyond the very institution claiming to represent him. Perhaps what Jesus embodied wasn't a set of beliefs requiring institutional mediation, but a psychological practice accessible through direct experience. Not future salvation through correct doctrine, but present redemption through freedom from resentment. What might this look like in practice? It means examining the gap between Jesus' reported practice and its institutional transformation, noticing how the challenging psychological state he apparently embodied was systematically transformed into something more manageable and less threatening. It means asking whether authentic engagement with Jesus might require psychological transformation rather than doctrinal adherence, present practice rather than future promise, direct experience rather than institutional mediation. It means developing relationship to Jesus beyond both naive faith and naive rejection, recognizing that the historical figure might be far more challenging and interesting than either traditional Christianity or its critics have acknowledged. The Jesus who emerges from Nietzsche's analysis isn't merely theological construct, but psychological pioneer, someone who embodied a particular practice of life characterized by freedom from resentment, absence of resistance, and universal love beyond moral judgment. Most importantly, it means recognizing that engaging with Jesus' actual approach might require moving beyond the very institution claiming to represent him, distinguishing between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus. This isn't mere rejection of Christianity, but recognition that Jesus' practice might be recovered precisely by stepping outside the theological framework constructed around him, by engaging with his psychological approach rather than the doctrinal system built in his name. The path forward isn't about more perfect theological understanding, but recognition of how thoroughly Jesus' message was transformed after his death. Whether within traditional Christian frameworks or beyond them, authentic engagement with Jesus requires distinguishing between the historical figure and the theological construct built around him, between the challenging psychological practice he embodied and the more manageable religious system that emerged in his name. What might become possible if you distinguish between Jesus and Christianity, between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus? What aspects of his approach might you discover beyond the theological framework that has both preserved and transformed his memory? What psychological practice might emerge if you separated Jesus' actual approach from its institutional domestication? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect doctrinal understanding, but from recognition of the gap between Jesus' challenging practice and its theological transformation. As Nietzsche suggests, authentic engagement with Jesus might begin precisely where Christianity ends, with recognition that the last Christian died on the cross. Perhaps the most profound insight isn't that Christianity misrepresented Jesus, but that his actual practice remains available beyond the very institution claiming to represent him, not through theological system, but through psychological transformation, not through future promise, but through present practice, not through institutional mediation, but through direct experience. The real journey isn't becoming more perfectly Christian, but recognizing how thoroughly Christianity transformed Jesus' message, and discovering what aspects of his approach might be recovered beyond the theological framework constructed around him. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating truth of all is that Christianity isn't the religion of Jesus, but the religion against Jesus. That recovering his actual approach might require stepping outside the very tradition bearing his name.